By mid-1940, the United States Army had a quiet problem that could erase it long before the first real shot reached its own shores. On maps in Washington, colored pins showed what had happened across the Atlantic. Modern armored formations had cut through Poland and France with unnerving speed. Lines that were supposed to hold for weeks had folded in days. Reports described columns of vehicles moving in coordination, delivering infantry, supplies, and commanders over distances that older armies simply could not match. Then American planners looked at their own tools. They saw horses still listed in tables of organization, dispatch riders balancing messages on heavy road motorcycles that struggled in rain, slid in mud, and turned soft ground into traps. Civilian trucks painted in olive drab and told to pretend they were ready for cross-country work. Staff cars that looked elegant on parade routes and useless anywhere without pavement. Across thousands of pages of manuals, something obvious was missing. A compact machine that could lead, scout, tow, carry, turn on a narrow path, and keep moving when the road dissolved. The conclusion, though few said it out loud, was simple. In the next large conflict, if nothing changed, American units would not be outthought first. They would be outmoved. So the Quartermaster Corps did something unusual. It put on paper a set of requirements that sounded like a challenge thrown at reality itself. The Army asked American manufacturers for a vehicle that did not exist: four-wheel drive, short wheelbase, room for a small team and equipment, able to climb, wade, and cross broken ground, strong enough to be useful yet light enough for transport, simple enough to repair in a field, and, most striking of all, a complete prototype ready for testing in 49 days. 49 days from idea to running machine. The request went out to more than 100 companies. On desks at the big firms, experienced engineers read the specifications and did the math. New designs usually took years from concept to pilot model. Tooling, drawings, sourcing, tests, none of that fit into 7 weeks. The first reaction in many large offices was amusement. The second was refusal. Some never sent a serious reply. Others politely asked for more time, knowing that the Army's calendar did not pause for them. On paper, the impossible demand had done exactly what logic predicted. It had cleared the field. The industrial giants that should have been the obvious champions stepped back, which left an opening no one had planned for. In a small town in Pennsylvania, in a plant that had once built compact cars and now stood mostly silent, the request landed like a last possible spark. American Bantam Car Company was not planning new lines. It was planning for auctions. Production had dwindled. Skilled workers had gone elsewhere. The building that had echoed with presses and welders was now mostly empty space. For Bantam's leadership, the Army's proposal was not just another contract. It was the only door still ajar. Frank Fenn, the company's president, understood exactly how thin their situation was. He also understood that even if Bantam wanted to attempt this miracle, they no longer had the staff to design an entirely new vehicle from scratch. One name came to mind: a freelance engineer in Detroit with a reputation for practical creativity and no current employer to shield him from risk. Karl Probst. He was in his mid-50s, with decades of experience behind him but very little security in front of him. He had drawn for large firms, solved packaging puzzles, and navigated the unglamorous details of turning ideas into workable frames. When Fenn called and outlined the challenge, 49 days, four-wheel drive, strict limits, no budget cushion, Probst's first response was sensible. He declined. The timing was too tight. The company too weak. The odds too poor. Fenn called again. He spoke not in terms of sales, but of urgency. The Army needed something no one else was willing to even attempt. Bantam would collapse without trying. The country might pay a heavy price if everyone respectable stayed cautious. Come down, Fenn said. You don't have to accept. Just look. 2 days later, Probst walked into the quiet plant in Butler and met what was left of the staff. The atmosphere was not corporate. It was personal. A handful of people who had refused to let go of their workplace stood waiting to hear whether this visitor could see any path forward at all. They showed him the Army's requirements: length, width, payload, capabilities, schedule. He ran through them in his head. The specified maximum weight, in particular, made little sense for a vehicle that also had to carry 4 people and use robust components. Even before picking up a pencil, he knew that obeying every line of the specification sheet literally would produce something fragile or imaginary. He told them as much. In a straightforward tone, he explained that the numbers did not match the physics. Then he said he would be returning to Detroit. For a long moment after that, he did not move. History rarely records the exact sentence that changes its course. No one can quote precisely what passed through Probst's mind as he looked at the vacant factory floor, the tired faces, the papers on the table. Pride at being told it was impossible. Concern for what would happen if the Army's request went unanswered. A sense that all his years of knowing how real cars were actually built were about to be tested at once. Whatever the combination, his decision reversed. He sat down at a drawing board. He told Fenn he would not take a salary. And with that, an unemployed engineer in a nearly silent plant accepted a task that larger firms with deeper pockets had already refused. The clock, for Bantam and for Probst, started at that moment. 49 days to prove that the mad idea of a go-anywhere, do-everything-light car was not fantasy after all. Karl Probst began not with speeches, but with lines. He spread out the Army specification sheet, noted what had to be honoured and what could not be, and started drawing a vehicle that was less a sketch of dreams and more a map of available reality. He knew the weight target was overly optimistic if the car was to survive harsh use. He also knew no one in a foxhole would care whether a form met a number on an early memo if the machine did its job. 5 intense days, the lights above his drafting table stayed on while most of Butler slept. He worked alone, yet never in isolation from the problem. Each stroke of the pencil was a compromise between strength and simplicity. He selected a frame layout that could be made from straight, easy-to-form sections rather than exotic curves. He placed seats and fuel and spare wheel where mechanics could reach them without dismantling half the vehicle. He arranged the hood line, fenders, and clearance not for glamour, but for approach angles and repair access. He raided his memory of existing parts. Instead of designing every component fresh, an instant way to blow both schedule and budget, he built his concept around pieces that manufacturers already produced. Axles from known suppliers, a gearbox from a proven car, a transfer case that could be adapted quickly. This parts bin philosophy, which some might sneer at from a design pedestal, was exactly what the 49-day clock demanded. He did his own weight estimates as he went. Each bracket and cross member received a number. When he added them up, the total stepped past the Army's strict maximum. He circled it, thought for a moment, and did not erase. He chose to prioritize sturdiness over strict compliance, gambling that if the machine performed, the same officers who wrote the numbers would quietly forgive what the paper said. On the 5th day, he stood up from the table with a full set of working drawings. In those rolled sheets was the outline of a compact, square-shouldered vehicle. Flat grille, short overhangs, simple bodywork, for driven wheels, seating for a small team. It was not pretty in the romantic sense. It looked purposeful, like a tool. Blueprints alone, though, did nothing on a slope or in a mud hole. To matter, this idea had to roll under its own power before the deadline. That task fell to a plant that, weeks before, had been sleepwalking toward closure. News went out quietly through Butler that Bantam had taken on a critical Army project. There were no billboards, just conversations in kitchens and on sidewalks. Welders who had hung up their gloves heard that the doors were open again. Machinists who had drifted to odd jobs heard that the lathes might spin. One by one, they walked back in, some without being formally called, simply because they could not ignore the chance to build something that might help the country and save their factory. This was not a sleek assembly line with endless conveyors. It was a group of experienced hands gathering around fresh drawings, figuring out how to turn them into steel and bolts in far too little time. Probst was no longer just a designer. He became an interpreter between paper and people, explaining why a crossmember had to sit here, why a mounting point needed more reinforcement, where a tolerance could stretch and where it could not. Alongside him, factory manager Harold Christ orchestrated material orders, work shifts, and whatever local resources could be convinced to join. They ran into problems immediately. The planned axle supplier initially quoted a timeline measured in months. Probst pushed back, telling them to forget custom designs and send their strongest existing units. Transfer case specialists hesitated. He persuaded them with the same argument. There was no room in this project for elegant, slow perfection. Only robust, fast decisions counted. Body panels were cut and formed by hand. Frames were welded in jigs that had been adjusted on the fly. Electrical wiring, steering linkages, pedal placements. Each piece seemed to raise a question no manual pre-answered. The workers solved them in a blend of skill and improvisation, guided by a man who had 5 intense days' worth of the entire vehicle already in his head. As the skeleton turned into a recognizable machine, the pressure tightened. The deadline was fixed. The car had to arrive at the Army's testing ground at Camp Holabird by a specific afternoon. Not just finished in the factory, but driven there, ready to run under watchful eyes that had seen too many promises fall apart in fields of mud. While Butler's crew labored through days and nights, far to the south a large-scale training exercise in Louisiana was showing in practical terms why this odd little car mattered. There, motorcycles bogged down within sight of their starting points when rain turned dirt to glue. Messages meant for forward units arrived hours late, or never. Trucks designed for roads sat helpless on soft ground. Entire simulated regiments were ruled out of action by umpires simply because their transport had failed them. Observers wrote reports that sounded less like maneuvers and more like warnings. If real opponents replaced designated red forces, if real shells replaced colored flags, the cost of slow, fragile mobility would not be theoretical. None of that changed the number of days on Bantam's calendar. It did, however, sharpen the sense, shared quietly among the workers, that they were not just chasing a contract. They were racing an unfolding reality. By the time the last week arrived, the prototype sat on its wheels, engine mounted, basic body panels in place. But assembled did not mean ready. Lines leaked. Linkages needed adjustment. Tires had yet to prove themselves outside a factory yard. They lit the engine. It coughed, caught, and settled. Around it, tired faces allowed themselves brief, cautious miles. There was no time for more. The car still had to cover roughly 250 miles to Baltimore on normal roads, within the dwindling hours of that 49-day promise. It would be the first true test, not in a brochure, not on a chalkboard, but on asphalt and concrete where a breakdown would erase weeks of effort. So, with paint still soft to the touch and tools piled in the back just in case, Karl Probst and Harold Christ climbed in, pointed the hand-built machine toward the highway, and set off, two men in an unproven vehicle, carrying on its axles the future of their company and a portion of their country's hopes for a modern army. The first miles felt like a verdict waiting to be spoken. The prototype rolled out of Butler's gates with its panels barely dry, its weld scarcely cooled, and two men listening to every vibration as if the car were a living argument that might suddenly decide to quit. This was not a polished showroom model. It was a proof of concept hammered together under a clock. They took ordinary public roads. No escort, no support convoy. Just a compact, boxy vehicle with unfamiliar lines humming past farms and towns where people stopped to stare. It did not look like anything from a brochure. Short hood, flat sides, upright windshield. Nothing about it said comfort. Everything hinted at purpose. 4 hours, the car behaved better than anyone had a right to expect. The engine pulled steadily. The borrowed transmission shifted. The hastily aligned axles ran true. Probst and Christ spoke little. Their attention was in their hands, in the feedback from the wheel, in the way the chassis flexed over rough patches. Sometime in the dark hours, as they approached the outskirts of Harrisburg, the quiet broke. A sharp metallic sound snapped through the cabin. The steering wheel jerked violently. The vehicle lunged off its line and shuddered to a halt beside the road. For a long second, neither man said anything. Then Probst grabbed a flashlight and climbed out. Under the front end, he found the culprit. A joint in the steering linkage had failed. Not a dramatic fracture of a major beam, not a catastrophic collapse. A small part. A connector piece. Exactly the sort of component that, in a better-funded project, would have been over-engineered and stocked in multiples. They had no spare. No support truck. No time to wait. On that quiet stretch of highway, in the cool night air, Probst made another decision that bent the rules. He reached for the modest toolkit they had thrown into the back as an afterthought. Among the wrenches and odds and ends was a small welding torch. Lying in the roadside dirt, he repaired the failed joint the only way available, by fixing it solid. It was not elegant. It limited the steering's freedom. Any engineer reviewing it in a calm office would circle it with red ink. But it restored control well enough to move. When he slid back into the seat, hands marked with grease, there was no speech about risk. Just a shared understanding. If this car did not reach Camp Holabird on time, all their careful drawings and exhausted shifts would dissolve into a story about what almost happened. They drove on. Morning brought them into Baltimore with the vehicle still running. A little scarred, slightly compromised in turning radius, but intact. At the gate of the Army's testing facility, they arrived with less than an hour to spare. The odd little car, streaked with road grime and bearing the evidence of its nighttime repair, rolled to a stop in front of officers who had been warned to expect something unconventional. They were not alone. Representatives from larger manufacturers were on hand as observers, invited to watch what many quietly assumed would be Bantam's failure to deliver. Well-dressed engineers, notebooks ready, surveyed the boxy machine and the two road-weary men beside it. To them, this did not look like the work of a major contender. It looked handmade, almost improvised. The first formality was weight. On the scales, the number came up over the Army's stated maximum. The point was quickly seized. Rules were rules. On paper, that alone could end the conversation. If the requirement sheet were treated as sacred instead of a guide, the test could have stopped there. But the officers in charge did not close the folder. They had read the reports from Louisiana. They knew how many motorcycles had bogged down, how often trucks had stalled before reaching critical points. They understood that while numbers in columns mattered, performance in mud mattered more. Here, in front of them, was the only company that had met the impossible schedule with a functioning example. One of them simply said, "Start it." The engine turned over and caught. No drama, just a steady sound that filled the skeptical pause. What followed was not a polite demonstration. It was deliberate hardship. The testers sent the Bantam across deep, clinging mud designed to trap vehicles heavier and more fragile than themselves. The compact car plunged in, all four wheels digging. Where two-wheel drive machines would spin, this one crawled, stuttering but moving, then emerging without needing a tow. They pointed it at steep grades, loose surfaces, sudden turns. It climbed slopes that conventional cars would not attempt without a run-up. It wound through tight spaces, its short wheelbase working like a hinge. It splashed through water, took jolts that would have loosened panels on lightly built sedans, and came back circling, ready for more. Each segment of the course was an answer to a question the Army had been asking since those troubling maneuvers. Can we trust a small vehicle to go where messages, scouts, and leaders need to go, without giving up halfway? By the end of the trials, one thing was clear to those who mattered. The car from Butler, rough edges and all, behaved far more like the tool they had imagined than any motorcycle or converted road car had. Karl Probst had not produced a brochure piece. He had produced a platform. Standing at the edge of the field, some of the visiting observers from larger firms stopped smiling. There was no denying that the prototype, born in a nearly bankrupt plant from the work of a small team and one determined engineer, had done something their organizations had labeled unworkable. But technical success was only the first part of the story. The next decisions would determine who built this new kind of vehicle in quantity, and whether the people who had taken the initial leap would be allowed to stand in its light. The report from Camp Holabird was concise, but between the lines it said everything. The Bantam reconnaissance car had not only arrived, it had performed. It showed that a compact four-wheel drive machine could exist, could be built quickly, could climb, crawl, and endure the kind of treatment real operations would demand. It turned the Army's fantasy request into a running vehicle. For a brief moment, the smallest player in the room was the only one with a real answer. Bantam received an initial order for a small batch. It was recognition, but it was also a signal of the next, larger obstacle, volume. The Army did not need hundreds of vehicles. It would soon need tens of thousands. And everyone in Washington knew that a single modest factory in Butler, working 3 shifts, could not supply a global war. This is where gratitude and practicality collided. To standardize maintenance, logistics, and training, the Army needed a common pattern. To get that pattern, it needed drawings. So the request came, provide full technical documentation for the Bantam design so it could be properly evaluated, supported, and, if adopted, scaled. From Butler's perspective, refusing was unthinkable. This project had revived their plant, given their town a sense of purpose, and offered them a role in something far larger than their balance sheet. They turned over the drawings that Karl Probst had created in those first sleepless days. The design that existed only because one engineer had been willing to work without a contract fee was now officially in Army hands. And once that happened, the competition changed shape. Larger manufacturers, who had initially laughed at the 49-day requirement, were invited back in, this time not to guess, but to iterate. They were given access to the same baseline concept that Bantam had pioneered and asked to submit their own interpretations. Willis Overland came forward with a strong engine and a robust chassis. Ford, with deep expertise in mass production, focused on simplicity of manufacture. Flat panels, stamped parts, a grille that could be made in large quantities with minimal fuss. Bantam continued refining its own model, improving details within the constraints of its limited capacity. At Camp Holabird and other fields, Three prototypes now lined up side by side: Bantam's compact original, Willis' more powerful variant, and Ford's production-oriented design. Tests were intense, methodical, and unsentimental. This was not about rewarding effort. It was about finding a machine that could be built, driven, and repaired by the thousands under urgent conditions. Each contender had strengths, and none was perfect. Bantam's car remained agile and well-balanced, but its engine lacked the extra pull commanders wanted. Willis offered torque and climbing ability, but with greater weight and a somewhat rough layout. Ford's entry was not as refined in performance but was cleverly tuned for rapid assembly. Faced with 3 partial answers and no time for a complete restart, the Army took an approach that was as blunt as it was effective. Instead of choosing a single winner, technical staff combined elements. They took the proven layout principles that Bantam's design had demonstrated: wheelbase, stance, general proportions that worked off-road. They matched it with Willis' strong Go Devil engine, whose extra power gave valuable margin. They incorporated Ford's practical production touches, including a grille design that was easy to stamp and instantly recognizable. Out of many test runs, a composite standard emerged: a small, square, sturdy vehicle that was, in spirit, a direct descendant of Bantam's frantic 49-day effort, strengthened by improvements from firms that had initially set out the impossible deadline. The Army designated the Willis MB as its primary light reconnaissance and utility vehicle. Ford would also build it under license to meet volume demands. Shared patterns, shared parts, one core shape. In Butler, the news landed with mixed weight. On one hand, their fundamental idea had been validated at the highest level. The key decisions: compact size, 4-wheel drive, flat fenders, minimal overhangs, rugged frame, were all there in the standardized vehicle. On the other hand, the largest contracts went to companies with larger plants. Bantam was awarded only a fraction, along with work on trailers and support equipment. There was no dramatic confrontation, no courtroom reversal. War needs speed. Procurement leaned toward scale. And as the nation shifted into full production, the small factory that had dared to answer first watched others take up its blueprint and carry it into history. For Karl Probst, the result was both extraordinary and understated. His mad idea had passed its trial. The world's largest army was about to adopt a machine built upon the architecture he had drawn under impossible pressure. His name, however, would rarely be attached to the photographs. What mattered next would not be signatures on contracts, but the way that small vehicle performed when loaded with real soldiers, real stretchers, real supplies, on real terrain far from any drafting board. The true measure of the little vehicle's success did not appear in boardrooms. It appeared in how quickly soldiers stopped noticing it as something special and started treating it as something expected, like boots or canteens. Once standardized, production ramped up with a speed that would have seemed unreal only a year earlier. Crates holding the compact 4-wheel machines rolled onto ships and trains bound for climates and landscapes their designers would never see in person. The outline stayed the same: flat hood, low silhouette, seating for a small crew, room for tools or stretchers or radios, for driven wheels ready for uneven ground. In North Africa, where heat, dust, and distance punished anything with an engine, the vehicle proved why its simplicity mattered. It did not rely on delicate bodywork or complex systems. Mechanics could strip and rebuild major components under a canvas shade with basic tools. Patrols that once depended on slow trucks or vulnerable bikes now used these small cars to cross rough ground, scout ridgelines, and carry teams far from paved routes. In the Mediterranean hills, it climbed where heavier transport stalled. Units learned that if a narrow track or rocky slope looked barely passable, the new car stood a good chance of making it. That changed how commanders thought about routes. Instead of following only broad roads that were easy to observe and block, they could choose smaller paths, keeping movement flexible. On other fronts, the same pattern repeated in different conditions. Across rain-soaked lanes and hedgerows, the vehicle became a moving platform for signals and coordination. Officers did not need bulky staff cars. They bounced forward in something that could turn in a farmyard and back through a gate without fuss. Medical teams slid stretchers across the rear and turned it into a light ambulance, able to reach places larger vehicles avoided. On long supply runs, the car acted as a courier, not of folded paper alone, but of people who had to see, decide, and return quickly. Its open sides made it easy to load and unload in a hurry. Its straightforward controls meant that a driver trained on one version could handle another without a steep learning curve, even if it came from a different factory. Allied nations quickly recognized its usefulness. Through aid programs, the compact four-wheel machines appeared on other uniform strength reports. On the Eastern Front, crews valued a vehicle that could tow a small gun or trailer through heavy mud where wagons struggled. In mountain regions, units appreciated something that could edge around hairpin bends with a short wheelbase and firm traction. Special operations units, always searching for tools that let small groups move fast and quietly, modified the vehicle again. They stripped unnecessary panels, added extra fuel cans, mounted light weapons where regulations allowed, and used the platform as a fast approach and exit tool across open ground that would have been impossible on foot in the same time. What linked all these variations was not glamour, but reliability. The car started in the morning. It accepted rough handling. It carried more weight than its original figures had politely listed. When parts wore out, they could be replaced by others drawn from a common pool shared between manufacturers. Soldiers found that if they treated it with basic care, it responded. If they overloaded it, it often forgave them. Officers who had once watched motorcycles sink in Louisiana mud now traveled in convoys of these compact machines, steering through fields and forest tracks without needing a road map that avoided every soft patch. In memories recorded later, many veterans did not recall discussion of brand names or contract details. They recalled that in cold, wet, unfamiliar places, there was usually a small sturdy car nearby that could be counted on to move people, pull loads, and keep functioning when larger equipment paused. It is here that the scale of Probst's mad idea becomes clear. He had not just helped meet a checklist. He had triggered the arrival of a standard tool that rewrote how mobility at the smallest level worked. The machine's genius was that it felt unremarkable once fielded. It simply did its job so consistently that its absence became hard to imagine. In official communiques, the little car began to appear only as a designation and a number. In photographs, it appeared constantly, almost incidentally, in the background of planning sessions, beside aircraft on improvised strips, loaded with maps, radios, stretchers, fuel cans. It was no longer the miracle prototype from Butler. It was simply the vehicle everyone expected to be there. Commanders noticed its influence in ways that were straightforward and measurable. Bridges that could not take the weight of heavy trucks could easily support a column of these compact four-wheelers. Narrow forest paths that would have stopped larger transports became usable supply routes. Quick relocations of small units, once constrained by marching speed, now happened at the pace of an engine. The car's ability to carry a squad, a crew-served weapon, or a full load of supplies without demanding a graded road quietly expanded what was tactically possible. For medical teams, the effect was personal. In places where terrain or distance had once turned evacuation into an ordeal, the small vehicle allowed faster movement with a stable platform. Its low profile made loading smoother. Its four-wheel drive let it reach casualties over ground that would have challenged an ambulance built on a heavier chassis. Signals units, too, found a natural ally. Radios of the time were bulky and power-hungry. Mounted in the back of the little car with a simple frame and antenna, they turned into mobile communication hubs that could be repositioned in minutes. That flexibility tightened coordination between scattered elements in a way paper diagrams rarely capture. Even in rear areas, the same pattern held. The car became a shuttle for specialists, tools, supplies, liaison officers, anyone and anything that needed to move quickly without ceremony. It removed friction. A headquarters that once might wait hours for an inspection team to arrive could now send them across uneven ground in a fraction of the time. On other continents, in other uniforms, similar stories emerged. Crews in wide plains and frozen forests spoke of the vehicle as if it were a member of the team, always available, stubbornly cooperative, rarely complaining even when loaded beyond its formal rating. This quiet loyalty earned it nicknames, informal ones that carried affection more than technical precision. What set it apart from many wartime creations was that it was not delicate. Some cutting-edge machines required carefully controlled maintenance and ideal fuel. This car accepted average fuel, average tools, average conditions. It could be driven cautiously by a new recruit or creatively by a seasoned sergeant and still perform. Parts interchanged. Instructions were simple. With each month, more drivers knew instinctively how to coax it through soft ground without burying it. Back in the United States, production lines at Willis and Ford pressed on relentlessly. Frames, engines, axles, and bodies flowed together in an industrial rhythm that answered the enormous demand. Shared standards, born from that combined design approach, meant that a part from one plant could serve in a vehicle from another. For supply officers juggling rail cars and convoys, that compatibility was a gift. In Butler, the view was different. Bantam received orders for a limited run of its own vehicles and, notably, for sturdy little trailers to be towed behind the now standard car. These contracts kept lights on and people employed for a time. But as the larger manufacturers scaled up, it became clear that the central story of the vehicle would be told with other logos on the data plates. Probst, true to form, did not spend his days publicly protesting. He continued to design, consult, and work, while others gradually came to see him as the man who helped start it. Recognition came in small, delayed ways. Mentions in articles, nods in specialist histories. The broader world, busy with headlines about campaigns and conferences, rarely heard his name. Yet every time a compact four-wheel machine bounced along a rutted track, carrying people who needed to be there on time, it was echoing a choice he had made in a nearly empty factory. To accept a task without a safety net, to trust that a practical, honest design built quickly could outmatch cautious perfection that never left the drawing board. The paradox of his mad idea was that its success made it look obvious in hindsight. Once the vehicle existed and proved itself, it was easy to say, of course someone had to build something like this. Only by rewinding to that July day in Butler, when large firms declined and a single engineer agreed to work for free, does its unlikely origin regain its proper sharpness. As the war expanded, the compact four-wheel car slipped into roles no committee could have fully predicted. On rugged islands in the Pacific, it threaded along narrow dirt tracks barely wider than its tires, bringing forward supplies that would otherwise have moved on tired shoulders. With its short nose and tight turning circle, it could weave between palms, skirt craters, and roll up close to improvised positions where larger trucks dared not go. Crews quickly realized they could remove the canvas top, fold the windshield, and adapt the vehicle to whatever the environment demanded. In mountain regions, where steep inclines and hairpin bends punished heavy machines, the little car behaved like a stubborn climber. It carried signal crews to ridgelines, brought food and water to scattered positions, and towed light guns to angles that surprised opposing planners who assumed certain slopes were secure simply because they were hard to reach. In coastal landings, long before heavy armor came ashore, these vehicles splashed down ramps and onto beaches, engines humming, carrying officers, medics, and communication teams. Their job was not to break defenses. It was to stitch together the flow of information and movement, who needed to go where, which unit had arrived, where support should head next. Their presence helped reduce confusion in the most fragile first hours of any operation. In cold forests, where snow and frozen ruts turned roads into narrow corridors, the vehicle's light footprint and four-driven wheels let it nudge along paths that were barely maintained. It became a courier between isolated pockets, a transporter for warm clothing, fuel, and medical equipment, a visible sign that nobody had been left completely on their own. Part of its strength came from how inviting it was to adapt. Mechanics did not hesitate to bolt on brackets for specific tools, to add racks, to tweak lighting, to rig simple canvas doors against wind. Radio operators mounted sets in the rear. Engineers loaded it with mine detectors and marking flags. Reconnaissance teams penciled notes on the hood. Its flat surfaces and open layout made it the opposite of a sealed, delicate machine. It welcomed modification. To logisticians, another quiet victory stood out. Because the Army had forced standardization early, the supply chain stayed manageable. A crate with parts arriving at a port could support vehicles built hundreds of miles apart, because the core design had been aligned. This joined-up thinking, born from that decision to blend Bantam's concept with Willis and Ford's strengths, reduced downtime far more effectively than any flashy single innovation. Among soldiers, trust in the vehicle grew from lived experience. When it struggled, they understood why: too steep, too overloaded, too soft underfoot. When they treated it with respect, it responded. It earned, not by slogan but by repetition, a reputation as something that was on their side. All the while, the machine carried inside it a story of one engineer, one nearly silent factory, and a deadline that sane people had called impossible. That backstory rarely surfaced at the front. It did not need to. The truest measure of Karl Probst's decision was that crews thousands of miles away could take his work for granted. With victory came reflection, and in that quieter period, key figures began to put into words just how significant the small car had been. Senior commanders who had watched the transition from horses and heavy sedans to fast, nimble vehicles pointed to three practical tools that had unlocked modern operations: reliable transport aircraft, portable anti-armor weapons, and a light four-wheel car that seemed to be everywhere at once. War correspondents who spent their time with frontline units wrote about it in simple terms. It went where they went, stayed when they stayed, and kept working even when conditions turned harsh. Yet, as official histories took shape, the story often slid into broad strokes. The Jeep became a single neat label, attached mostly to the companies that had produced it in huge numbers. Somewhere between those labels and footnotes, the intense 49 days in Butler, the all-night drafting sessions, the improvised road repair in a dark ditch, lost their sharp edges. Looking closely, the narrative reveals three uncomfortable truths that also make it compelling. First, the initial specification was, by conventional standards, unreasonable. Without that pressure, it is unlikely anyone would have moved fast enough. The risk was that everyone would say no. Most did. Second, the breakthrough came not from a major player, but from a struggling firm and an individual willing to embrace that pressure. The first working answer to the Army's puzzle was not produced by a vast design bureau. It was produced by a small team guided by one person's refusal to accept that a bad requirement or a tight schedule meant no solution existed. Third, once the idea proved itself, systems of scale inevitably took control. The industrial giants that could deliver thousands of units became the public face of the vehicle. The originators did not receive proportionate credit or contracts. From one angle, that looks unfair. From another, it shows the complicated intersection of innovation, urgency, and mass production. A field needs both sparks and engines, a moment of creative courage to show what is possible, and then large, disciplined organizations to repeat it so many times that it shapes reality. For storytellers, and for your audience, this combination is exactly what holds attention. A bold decision, a race against time, a quiet redirection of recognition, and an outcome that still changed how ordinary people moved across extraordinary landscapes. And at the center, an engineer whose mad idea was, in truth, simply the choice to start drawing when others had stopped reading. The technical brilliance of the vehicle can be explained without mistake. It used a narrow, simple frame with just enough flexibility to handle rough ground without twisting apart. It put weight low and wheels at the corners, giving stability. It used an engine strong enough to pull loads, but not so exotic that it demanded specialized attention. It routed controls in direct, mechanical ways that any competent mechanic could understand at a glance. Nothing about it was wasted.
No WW2’s.
No fragile systems for show. That restraint, driven first by necessity and then by standardization, is why it transitioned so smoothly into peacetime. When the conflict ended, many of these vehicles did not go straight to scrap. They found second lives on farms, construction sites, forest trails, and remote roads worldwide. People who had never worn a uniform appreciated the same traits soldiers had: easy to fix, hard to intimidate, comfortable with bad roads. In this way, Probst's work did something rare. It bridged the gap between specialized military need and everyday utility. The proportions that made sense for reconnaissance also made sense for someone checking fence lines or hauling tools up a rough hill. The global image of a compact, capable off-road vehicle owes much to that first compressed design sprint in 1940. There is another lesson hidden beneath the metal. The Army's initial specification contained at least one unrealistic constraint. Probst saw that and chose not to be paralyzed by it. He did not use it as an excuse to walk away. He treated it as a signal of intent. They wanted lightness, agility, versatility. He delivered those qualities, even if a number on the page had to bend. That decision, understanding the purpose behind the rule, not just the letters, is at the heart of effective engineering and leadership. Many projects fail not because the problem is impossible, but because no one is willing to challenge an impractical line item with a working alternative. By putting performance first and trusting that success would earn forgiveness, he turned a questionable spec sheet into a historic machine. The ethical tension remains. His company carried the early risk, yet others received the vast rewards. That tension is worth acknowledging, not to diminish the achievements of big manufacturers that built hundreds of thousands reliably, but to restore balance in how we assign credit. Without Bantam and Probst, there is no early prototype. Without early prototype, there is no fast standardization. Without fast standardization, the scattered reports from Louisiana might have turned from warnings into outcomes. Every time we see a photo of that familiar grill, we are looking at the end result of that sequence. If we trace the story cleanly from start to finish, it looks like this. A rapidly changing world exposes a quiet but critical weakness. An army that can think, but not move, will lose to an army that can do both. Generals issue a request so ambitious that almost everyone dismisses it. Most experienced firms decide the schedule and conditions are unreasonable and step aside. In a nearly idle factory, An engineer walks in intending only to advise and instead chooses to commit. For 5 days, he turns conflicting demands into a real, buildable plan, using practical parts and bold judgment where the written rules do not align with physics. 4 weeks, a small group of workers and managers bring that plan to life by hand. They solve shortages with ingenuity. They solve fatigue with purpose. They solve a breakdown on a dark road with a weld that would make a perfectionist wince and a field mechanic nod. At the proving ground, the prototype performs. Not flawlessly, but convincingly enough to show that the mad idea is not mad at all. It is exactly what the problem requires. The system, needing scale, absorbs the concept. Designs are shared, refined, combined. Contracts go to those who can produce in volume. The originators are eased to the margins, their starring role compressed into a few lines in reports. The vehicle itself, however, answers only to results. It carries scouts, medics, officers, signals, tools, and hope across deserts, forests, mountains, and streets. It allows units to move when roads are cut, to coordinate when lines are thin, to retrieve when distance and mud would have once turned attempts into delays. Soldiers come to trust it so fully that it becomes almost invisible, part of the landscape of their effort. After the conflict, it continues working in fields and workshops, its design echoing forward into generations of off-road machines. Senior leaders later point to it as one of the quiet keys to success. Not dramatic, not heavily armed, but always there, always moving. At the heart of your video's title, how one engineer's mad idea created WW2’s most reliable car in just 49 days, is a simple truth. The decisive moment was not a stroke of genius in a perfect lab. It was an experienced, underestimated engineer in a nearly empty building, looking at a problem everyone else had set aside, and saying, "I'll start now. I'll build what you actually need, not what looks safe on paper." What followed? Hundreds of thousands of vehicles, countless journeys over ground that would once have stopped them, was the long shadow of that decision. For your viewers, that is the hook and the payoff. Not just that a famous machine existed, but that it began with a human choice, to treat an impossible deadline not as a reason to walk away, but as a reason to finally do what needed to be done.